She tried not to cry when he raised his voice, but the way the investigator looked at her made it almost impossible to stay calm, because he was not just asking questions, he was enjoying the way every word made her feel smaller. She sat quietly at the cold metal table, her hands resting on her stomach as if she was protecting the tiny life inside her from the cruelty in that room, and the fluorescent light above her flickered slightly, making everything feel even more tense and unreal. The investigator leaned closer and said again that she was lying, that women like her always lied when they got caught in something they could not explain, and his voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire career. She did not answer immediately, not because she was afraid of the truth, but because she had learned that silence was sometimes the only thing that still belonged to her when everything else had been taken away. Her name was Elena, and 3 hours earlier she had been sitting quietly in a small cafe, waiting for her husband to call her like he always did when he finished work, when 2 officers suddenly approached her table and asked her to come with them for a few questions. At first she thought there had been a mistake, something simple that could be explained in minutes, but the moment she stepped into the gray building and saw the serious faces around her, she felt a strange heaviness in her chest, like something was about to change forever. The investigator sitting across from her now did not care about explanations, he only cared about proving that he was right, and the more calmly she spoke, the more irritated he became. He slammed a folder on the table and said her name loudly, as if the sound itself could force her to confess to something she had never done, and Elena lowered her eyes for a second, not in shame, but to stop the tears from falling. She remembered her husband's voice from the night before, calm and warm, telling her not to worry about anything, telling her that everything would be fine as long as they stayed patient. He had always spoken that way, like a man who had already seen the worst things in life and no longer feared them. The investigator noticed her silence and smiled in a cold way, the kind of smile that comes from power, not from kindness, and he said that if she kept pretending to be innocent, the situation would only become worse for her. He said people like her always thought someone would save them at the last moment, but this was not a movie and nobody would walk through the door to protect her. The words hit deeper than he realized, because she had not told anyone where she had been taken, not even her husband, and for a moment she felt completely alone in that small room with the gray walls and the metal door behind her. She placed one hand more firmly over her stomach and tried to breathe slowly, reminding herself that fear would not help her or the baby. The investigator leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, clearly enjoying the way she struggled to stay calm, and he said again that he already knew everything, that he only needed her to admit it so the paperwork would be easier. Elena finally lifted her eyes and said quietly that she had nothing to admit, and the calmness in her voice surprised even herself. The investigator frowned slightly, because he expected tears, anger, or panic, not quiet strength, and he leaned closer again, lowering his voice in a way that felt even more threatening. He said he could make her life very difficult if he wanted to, and that pregnant women were not as protected as they believed. For a second the room felt smaller, the air heavier, and Elena's heart began to beat faster, but she did not look away. Instead, she remembered the way her husband had held her hand the first time they heard the baby's heartbeat, the quiet happiness in his eyes, the promise that no matter what happened, she would never face the world alone again. The investigator continued talking, his words sharper now, accusing her of things she had never even imagined, and each accusation felt like a small cut that slowly took away her strength. She felt sadness first, deep and heavy, the sadness of being misunderstood and treated like a criminal when all she had ever done was try to live quietly. Then came helplessness, the realization that no matter what she said, he had already decided what he wanted to believe. Minutes passed slowly, and the silence between his questions grew longer, but Elena stayed calm, repeating the truth in the same quiet voice every time he demanded an answer. Somewhere inside her, a small hope began to appear, not loud or dramatic, just a quiet belief that truth could not stay hidden forever. She did not know how or when things would change, but she trusted the patience her husband had always taught her, the patience that had helped him survive things he never talked about. The investigator eventually stood up and walked to the door, speaking to someone outside in a low voice, and for the first time since she entered the room, Elena was left alone. She closed her eyes for a second and placed both hands over her stomach, whispering softly that everything would be all right, even though she was not completely sure. When the door opened again, the same man returned, his expression slightly different, more irritated than confident, and he said that someone had come asking about her. Elena felt her heart stop for a second, because she had not expected anyone to know where she was, and the investigator watched her carefully, trying to see fear in her eyes. Instead, there was only quiet hope now, the kind that does not need words. He said the man outside claimed to be her husband and demanded to see her immediately, and then he laughed softly, saying that husbands often believed they could solve everything with loud voices and empty threats. Elena did not answer, but something inside her felt calmer than before, like a storm that had finally started to pass. A few seconds later, the door opened again, and the atmosphere in the room changed so suddenly that even the investigator seemed surprised. A tall man stepped inside slowly, his face calm but serious, and he did not look at the investigator first, he looked at Elena. The moment their eyes met, all the fear she had been holding inside disappeared, replaced by a quiet strength she had not felt since the questioning began. The investigator tried to speak, to remind the man that this was an official investigation and that he had no right to interrupt, but the words sounded weaker than before. The man simply nodded politely and said he understood the rules, but he also understood respect, and his voice was calm in a way that made the room feel smaller around him. He introduced himself quietly, not loudly, not proudly, just calmly, and the investigator's expression changed the moment he heard the name. It was not just a name, it was a reputation, the kind of reputation that people spoke about in whispers, the kind that came from years of service in places nobody wanted to talk about. The investigator's confidence disappeared almost instantly, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. Elena watched silently, still holding her hands over her stomach, and realized that justice sometimes arrives without noise, without anger, simply by standing in the room and refusing to let fear win. Her husband did not shout, did not threaten anyone, he only asked one simple question, why his pregnant wife had been treated like a criminal without proof. The calmness in his voice made the question impossible to ignore, and the investigator suddenly looked smaller than before, as if the power he had relied on had quietly left him. He opened the folder again, flipping through the pages as if hoping the answers would suddenly appear there, but the silence in the room made every movement feel slow and uncomfortable. Finally, he admitted that there might have been a mistake, that perhaps the situation had been misunderstood, and the words sounded like something he had never said before. Elena felt the sadness inside her slowly disappear, replaced by relief so quiet that it almost felt unreal. Her husband gently touched her shoulder, not to show strength, but to remind her that she was not alone anymore, and in that moment the entire humiliation she had endured lost its power. The investigator apologized quietly, avoiding her eyes, and Elena realized that the justice she had been waiting for did not come through anger or revenge, it came through truth and patience. When they finally left the room together, she felt lighter than she had in hours, even though the memory of the interrogation would stay with her for a long time. Outside the building, the air felt warmer, and her husband looked at her carefully, asking softly if she was all right. She nodded and smiled for the first time since that morning, because she finally understood that real strength is not loud, it is quiet, patient, and impossible to break. And as they walked away together, her hands still resting gently over her stomach, she knew that the world could be cruel, but it could never destroy someone who refused to lose their dignity, no matter how powerful the person on the other side of the table might seem.